Aid organisations from all over the globe work in almost every country in the world in some form or another, trying to put an end to hunger and disease, to bring peace or to promote democracy and education, all simply trying to make the world a better place. But is this the truth, or just a pipe dream that fails to recognise the self-perpetuating cycle of failed missions being replaced by the same people with a so-called new strategy under a new mandate? Governmental organisations representing a global community ranging from Eastern Europe to America, and including all the major organisations such as the UN, the EU and the OSCE, have been working in Georgia for more than a decade. Since the new president, Mikhail Saakashvili, took power, there's been a renewed focus by the international community on Georgia. Their interests range from peacekeeping and humanitarian projects where they distribute food and medical aid to conflict areas, to financial gain and the security of oil supplies. But all claim they're there to help Georgia. But is this true, or do they do little more than serve themselves? Most of these organisations are based in Tbilisi and appear, on the outside at least, to work tirelessly towards their aims. Diplomatic number plates are a common sight. Ambassadors, advisors, diplomats and field workers mix in the local cafes and restaurants, while private security firms protecting them and their homes patrol the city streets trying to ensure their safety. It's a multi-million-dollar industry in itself trying to help Georgia develop their legal, political and governmental institutions, while at the same time helping maintain peace in the region. But how effective is it? In 2000, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, better known as the OSCE, was asked to help Georgia monitor its borders. Georgia had been accused by Russia of allowing fleeing Chechen terrorists to cross easily into Georgia where they could rest and reorganise themselves. Specifically, Russia cited the Pankisi Gorge as being a hotbed of Chechen activity. Unable to convince Russia that this was not the case, Georgia asked the OSCE to help by providing monitors who could verify the truth of the situation. These monitors were placed in the mountains bordering Russia and tasked to report any illegal crossings both into or out of Georgia. This mission lasted little more than 4 years and had a budget of around 15 million euros a year, employing almost 200 international monitors and support staff. During this time, it was effective in keeping Russia at bay and helped prevent attacks by supposedly unidentified military aircraft in the Pankisi Gorge and other remote mountain areas. However, they also reported on average 800 illegal crossings each year, none of which were properly investigated or acted upon by the Georgian authorities. So although it kept the Russians under control, it did little if anything to address their accusations that Georgia was incapable of controlling its borders. On the 31st of December 2004, the OSCE border monitoring mission was eventually closed down when Russia refused to back a new mandate. This, in effect, left Georgia exactly where it was before the mission was launched, its borders protected by undermotivated, under-equipped conscripts incapable of properly controlling its border regions. While Russia seemed happy with this new situation due to the fact that during this period they'd been investing heavily in their own border defences and had fortified the areas bordering Georgia. But what about Georgia? What had they done during this 4-year period? They did nothing where the borders were concerned, but preferred instead to sit back and complain to the international community that it had no money to reform the border guard service, while at the same time spending more than $180 million on their Ministry of Defence. Disheartened by the failure of the OSCE to renew its monitoring mandate, the Georgian government turned to the European Union for support. This was timed to coincide with the end of the OSCE's mandate in the vain hope that it would pressurise the Russians into accepting an extension to the OSCE border monitoring programme, where they had some influence, rather than face an EU mission where they had none. Russia called the EU's bluff and instead preferred to use the talks on the extension of the OSCE mandate as a bargaining tool over the issue of conflicting election observation reports between the OSCE's own election observers and those of the CIS, the Russian equivalent to the European Union. the OSCE refused to back down and continued to claim interference in elections held in several Russian satellite states, and so the border monitoring mandate of the OSCE was effectively ended with no EU replacement. The OSCE did not give up and responded by rewriting its mandate to appeal to the Russians and proposed a new project aimed at keeping internationals in the border regions under the guise of training, but more accurately, many would claim, at keeping as many international workers in employment as possible. In the first year after the OSCE's border monitoring operation closed, there were no obvious repercussions. Both the Georgians and the Russians appeared to have accepted each other's standpoint. The Russians no longer making accusations, content that they were controlling the border adequately from their side, while the Georgians reported no unusual activity by the Russians in the border areas. Despite this peaceful situation, the OSCE still tried to maintain a presence in the Georgian borders, claiming that this was necessary in order to keep peace between Russia and Georgia, although there was by now no evidence to support this standpoint. Regardless of the facts and despite the lack of impact their training initiative had had, they continued to justify their existence by changing their training concept and claiming that this time their new approach was actually what the Georgians really needed.
There is no direct conversation
A year later, when this updated training programme approached its end, the OSCE launched another fruitless training initiative that again failed to take into account the realities of the Georgian border police and seemed more in the interests of protecting international jobs rather than helping Georgia. The concept was thrown together in a rush to meet the end of its mandate and based on a belief of what was needed rather than any proper assessment. Eventually, its budget running to many millions of euros over 2 years and its impact on increased Georgian border security, zero. Now, still working in Georgia, the OSCE border guard projects are still continuing this cycle of failed initiatives that have had no impact. It seems that a carefully worded report and well-written project proposal are enough to justify their continued involvement and secure funding for themselves for another 12 months. The only true benefactors being the internationals employed by the OSCE. Georgia itself has all but given up on the OSCE for help where its border reforms are concerned, admitting in private that they see the OSCE efforts as pointless, but prefer to keep them around and hope that they will simply provide funding or renovate some buildings to run their projects which the Georgians can later use for themselves. Instead, Georgia turned to the European Union for help. In April 2005, at the invitation of the Georgian government, a small team of experts from the European Union Special Representative's Office undertook an exploratory mission to assess the needs of the Georgian border police. Much to the Georgians' disappointments, they proposed a small number of personnel to continue the assessment and give advice to the border police as they went. This original mission was planned to last just 6 months and would allow Georgia the opportunity to demonstrate to the European Union its commitment to working with them. The catch being that if they failed to cooperate and take the European Union's advice, this would be taken as a signal of Georgia's inability to work with the European Union on wider issues being discussed under the EU's new action plan for Georgia. In this light, it was believed that Georgia would do all it could to support the activities of the European border team. The reality turned out to be quite different. Despite no obvious cooperation from the Georgian side or any real impact on their border security, an extension of the EU's border support mission went ahead and extended the border support team's mandate for a further 12 months, regardless of its lack of results. The EU simply ignored the fact that Georgia had done almost nothing to show support for the work the EU was trying to do. In a similar vein to the OSCE, the European Union Border Support Mission also rewrote its mandate to help its self-perpetuation. Although its new proposal was at least based on a thorough assessment, there was a large part left out. This was a part about the lack of commitment from Georgia and the fact that despite almost €2 million being spent on the mission, there was still no actual changes or impact on Georgia's border security. After 18 months spent working with the Georgians, the EU had still achieved nothing. Even the simple task of writing a basic set of operating procedures for the border guard had not been completed. No threat assessment of the different regions had taken place by the Georgians as they had been continually asked to do. The National Security Council that was tasked to draw up a border security strategy paper had nothing to show for its efforts either. And the patrolling and observation of the border actually declined during this period, despite all the training given by the OSCE and support from the EU. Yet despite this, no one from either of these organisations bothered to report this or ask why they were continuing to spend millions on projects that were constantly failing to achieve even the smallest of results. Instead, they chose to propose other ways they could work with the Georgians and keep their jobs. Amazingly, despite these failures, an extension to the EU mandate was given the go-ahead to continue. And why? Because no one wanted to admit the truth, that the Georgians were doing nothing to help themselves, and that the EU's border team could not find a way to work effectively with its Georgian counterparts, short of doing everything for them, including providing funding, something which many believe was the only real aim of the Georgians. The sad truth is, this is now happening, with the EU planning to provide around €200,000 for projects related to the border guard and customs, and the taxpayers of Europe simply asked to pick up the bill, while Georgia continues to spend its own money on its military forces instead. So is it worth it? You decide. Between them, the OSCE and the European Union have spent more than €70 million of taxpayers' money in the last 5 years alone. And that does not include the tens of millions of American money poured into the border guard and coast guard services. And the impact on changing the security of the Georgian border? None. Nothing. Nada. It is partly believed simply by implementing these missions has helped keep the peace in this region. However, none of these initiatives has led towards a permanent solution to the problem, and Georgia continues to take the international community for a ride, knowing that none of the organisations will actually carry out their threat of withdrawing their support for their entry to the EU's neighbourhood policy. Too much time and effort has been put into helping Georgia that it has become a runaway train with no one willing to pull on the brakes and too many people making too much money to even raise the alarm. Instead, projects being proposed by institutions like the OSCE or the EU continue to fail due to Georgia's lack of commitment. But in truth, no one cares. Many of the so-called experts working for these organisations are recruited by their individual governments and are attracted by the financial rewards rather than the work itself. Many countries send people with no verifiable qualifications or experience, but who would often appear to be well connected to the governments back home. It's been claimed many times that several nationalities have to pay bribes to be considered for posts with the United Nations or OSCE, and that part of their salary is paid to government officials to ensure their continued employment. It's no surprise when daily allowances can be more than a full month's salary to some nationalities, and a year's employment the equivalent to a lifetime in their home countries. The OSCE, for example, paid its border monitors a daily allowance of €158 a day, plus an extra €30 hazard pay for every day spent in the border area, and this was on top of the salaries their home governments give them. The United Nations can pay its employees up to $4,000 a month subsistence allowance over and above their annual UN salaries. With salaries in some Eastern European countries averaging only €500 to €600 a month, it's not hard to see the attraction to such posts. It's also not surprising to find that when a mission has run its course, that a mild panic sets in and results in a rush to find an excuse to extend the mandate and continue carrying out work, regardless of concrete results and real impact on the host country. While within Europe the OSCE has in part tried to replace the United Nations, recognising their internal problems and stagnating bureaucracy, it's not yet managed to hold itself up to the same scrutiny. As a diplomatic tool, it may have some value, but in terms of value for money, it's too busy trying to keep itself in work and justify its existence in other fields that, like so many other large organisations, it constantly fails to deliver any lasting results, but continues to cost the taxpayer large sums of money.